750. Just take a second and really let that number sink in. Right now, as we speak, the United States controls roughly 750 military bases spread across at least 80 different countries worldwide. This isn't just some logistical achievement, it is arguably the largest extraterritorial military footprint in human history. It's a massive global network that most of us rarely stop to think about, but it quietly shapes the entire geopolitical landscape every single day.
Welcome to the Explainer. Today we are going to bypass the politics, look straight at the hard data, and get into America's global military presence explained. Our mission is to really understand the massive scale of this deployment, the high-level strategic logic holding the whole shebang together, and the growing financial and operational controversies surrounding this immense footprint. So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The scope of the footprint, 2. Where troops are stationed, 3. The history of global expansion, 4. The strategic rationale, 5. The costs and controversies, and 6. The future of U.S. bases.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the scope of the footprint.
As of March 2026, there are 2.12 million people serving in the U.S. military. To put that into perspective for you, that number makes the Department of Defense one of the largest single employers on the planet. I mean, that figure includes everyone across the various branches, from the Army and Navy to the Air Force and Space Force, and they're stationed both domestically and overseas, coordinating a daily logistical ballet that literally spans multiple continents and time zones. Now, what's really fascinating here is the split. Out of those 2.12 million troops, 64% are active duty personnel. These are the forces continuously engaged in full-time military service, the ones actively manning the ships, flying the patrols, and maintaining the bases worldwide right this second. The other 36%? Those are reserve troops. These are highly trained individuals integrated into civilian life, essentially maintaining a state of readiness. They're waiting to be called up for sudden contingencies, disaster relief, or to augment active forces during major conflicts. So how are they housed globally? Well, those 750 foreign bases we talked about aren't all massive fortresses like you might imagine from the movies. Actually, about 60% are what the military classifies as large bases. These are installations over 10 acres or worth more than $10 million, and they often function a lot like small American towns, complete with schools, hospitals, and thousands of personnel. The remaining 40% are known as lily pads. These are smaller, highly agile sites, often cooperative security locations. And they're incredibly useful because they allow for rapid drone deployments or specialized counterterrorism missions, but without all the heavy political baggage or massive infrastructure of a permanent large base. Moving on to Section 2. Where exactly are troops stationed? Out of the roughly 174,400 active duty troops stationed abroad as of early 2026, they are remarkably concentrated. The vast majority sit in just 5 allied countries. Japan tops the list with nearly 54,900 troops, followed by Germany at 37,000. South Korea hosts over 23,000, while Italy and the UK round out the top 5. This isn't just some random scattering of forces, it's a highly focused deployment strategy. And, if you brush up on your 20th century history, you might notice a pattern. Japan, Germany, and Italy are former World War II adversaries, while South Korea represents the enduring legacy of the Cold War. Which brings us right to Section 3. The history of global expansion. That heavy concentration in places like Germany and Japan is the direct result of an 80-year timeline. Back in 1941, World War II catalyzed a massive global buildup, where the U.S. rapidly constructed more overseas bases than any empire in history to project power across 2 oceans. Following that, the 1950s and the onset of the Cold War meant a shift to containment and deterrence, establishing permanent, heavily fortified lines in places like West Germany and South Korea to block Soviet expansion. Then, moving into 2001, the War on Terror fundamentally changed the type of bases being built. We saw a surge of those smaller, agile lily pad deployments across the Middle East and Africa to facilitate rapid, irregular warfare. And now, in the 2020s, we are witnessing another historic pivot, shifting resources and establishing new defense pacts that are heavily focused on the Indo-Pacific region.
Section 4. The strategic rationale. Let's look at the modern geopolitical logic for keeping so many troops stationed abroad today.
According to strategic analysis from the Adelphi book series, specifically Jonathan Stevenson's work Optimizing America's Military Footprint, these overseas bases are the absolute bedrock of Washington's ability to project military power. The concept of optimizing in today's context means shifting away from massive ground occupations and moving towards specialized, highly networked facilities. These facilities exert political influence and serve as a constant, visible deterrent to potential adversaries long before a conflict ever begins. You see, each region has a very distinct strategic purpose. In Europe, the enduring presence is primarily meant to counter Russia and reassure NATO allies of an ironclad mutual defense commitment. Over in the Indo-Pacific, the strategy is intensely focused on maintaining a geopolitical balance against Beijing, which is actually the Pentagon's primary stated focus for future planning right now. And in the Middle East, the goal has historically been to deter Iran, protect critical global oil tanker routes in the Arabian Gulf, and maintain a footprint capable of responding to sudden, localized counterterrorism contingencies.
Section 5. The costs and controversies. Because obviously, maintaining an empire of this size doesn't come cheap. It costs roughly $55 billion annually just to maintain and sustain these overseas bases. $55 billion. To give that some scale, that number is more than the entire defense budgets of most developed nations. And remember, that is just the baseline to keep the lights on, the runways paved, and the facilities running. It doesn't even factor in the salaries of the troops or the cost of the actual weapons systems housed there.
We have to view this impartially because there are two very distinct sides to this policy debate. On one hand, strategists aligned with the Adelphi rationale argue that these forward-deployed bases provide vital deterrence, reassure allies, and uniquely allow the U.S. to respond to rapid contingencies anywhere on the globe within hours. But on the flip side, organizations like the Cato Institute counter that this sprawling presence actually risks entangling the U.S. in peripheral conflicts. They argue that encircling adversaries antagonizes opponents who might otherwise be less aggressive, and crucially, they point out that these fixed bases are becoming highly vulnerable to modern long-range missiles. And it's not just geopolitical theory. There are intense local controversies regarding the physical footprint of these installations. We're seeing significant pushback from host nations and territories like Japan and Guam regarding severe environmental damage. For example, issues like the Red Hill underground fuel storage spills in Hawaii or the contamination of local drinking water with toxic PFAS forever chemicals near bases in Okinawa have sparked massive local protests. These historical legacies of groundwater contamination and hazardous waste often leave host communities to deal with complex, hazardous, and wildly expensive cleanups long after operations have shifted.
Which brings us to our final section, the future of U.S. bases. Balancing these strategic necessities against growing political, financial, and environmental costs puts military planners at a major fork in the road. And this is driven by two huge factors: the rise of advanced technology and domestic fatigue from decades of forever wars. The proliferation of long-range precision strikes and hypersonic missiles means that massive, stationary bases like the sprawling complexes in Guam or Japan are now highly vulnerable targets that can be hit from thousands of miles away. This fundamentally alters the math of power projection. It makes these traditional forward-deployed bases less strictly necessary for some operations and significantly riskier to maintain in a high-tech conflict.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. In an era defined by long-range hypersonic technology, shifting global alliances, and complex budgetary pressures, will the United States continue its massive global encirclement, or is a historic pullback inevitable? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helped map out the reality behind the numbers.